Okay, because of time constraints, I'm not going into the prior and subsequent history of this subject of mystical existentiation, takween, today. I'm really just focusing on Kubrā. For example, the development of the Islamic cult of saints and the issue of the extent to which such patterns of belief were in a historical continuum with late antique, especially Christian, but also Jewish cultures of the Near East, is outside the scope of this paper. Certainly by the period of Najm Kubrā, who died in 618 Hijri, 1221 CE, the eponymous founder of the Kubrawi order, these notions were already fully naturalized within the Muslim thought world. In his own contemporary Khurāsān milieu, there had moreover been an influx of pagan Turkic elements. I'm thinking of the Kipchak, the military elite of Khurāsān at the time. Muslim theory of saints thereby mingled, at least on the popular level, with beliefs about healers, prognosticators, thaumaturges, and weather sorcerers, characteristic of pre-Islamic Turkic culture. Whether or not we apply to it the term shamanism, a disputed term, Kubrā himself can be taken as a major case of the belief in the holy personage's mediatory powers. When introducing Kubrā's book, the Fawāih al-Jamal, the fragrances of beauty in my translation, the unnamed disciple responsible for redacting it declares his master to be the axis of Islam, Qutb al-Islam, apparently alluding by this expression to his belief that he was the absolute head of the hierarchy of Muslim saints in his generation. The idea of the realized Sufi as a concealed agency for the unfolding of events, even up to a geopolitical scale, is implicit in the reaction attributed to Kubrā's close disciples to reports of the Mongol conquests, in which they expressed absolute confidence in the efficacy of his intercession. In fact, some of these reports have him answering that he himself had called on the Mongol conquests. The doctrine of the hierarchy of saints naturally figures in the writings of subsequent Kubrawi masters such as Aziz Nasafi, died 690/1291, and later Senani, died 736-1336. It would seem that certain representatives of the order went so far as to attempt some accommodation of the heterodox teaching that the saints were superior even to the prophets. Kubrā's direct disciple, Sa'd-ad-Din Hamuyya, is thus quoted as saying, "The final stages of the prophets are the first stages of the saints," thus reversing the usual form of this dictum. In Kubrā's own writings, we find the concept of the authority and supernatural agency of the realized saint, not from the more external viewpoint of the devotee or the hagiologist, who attributes such functions and powers to the realized Sufi, as it were, from the outside. He personally vouches for it instead as an integral natural consequence of traveling the path. And it even becomes a framework for him to systematize the Via Mystica. The Fawāih is a spiritual diary and confession, confessio, recounting its author's own private experience of the path. But the book is also pointedly described by him as a model, unmudaj, for aspirants. As an index of becoming an adept, divine empowerment described on the basis of the author's direct acquaintance could thus be viewed as one of the aspirant's expectations in pursuing the path. If we see the notion of saintly power from the outside in contemporary theories and popular notions of saintly agency, these are radically complemented by an insider's theory like Kubrā's, which maps out the mystic's acquisition of a faculty of existentiation, takwin, by, for instance, raising his or her determination or zealous intent, himma, through 3 interior levels. He presents the Sufi at the rank of the elder as capable of channeling the flux of reality and even of a kind of co-creativity with God. So let's try to capture the structures of Kubrā's thinking through some of his pronouncements on this subject in the Fawā'ih. A key motif is the interconnection between the consciousness internal to the human individual and external reality. Given this intense mutuality of the inner and the outer, the soul and the world, the former is not just the passive recipient of the latter, but it affects it at the deeper level. Early on in the text, the author, for example, states, "The soul's inundating flood is over external existence, and the latter's cultivation, tarbiyah, is through it. So if the soul is clean and pure, goodness floods over existence, and goodness in turn germinates from it. And if evil floods from the soul over existence, evil likewise germinates from it." Unquote. Kubrā clearly does not here restrict this claim to accomplished mystics, but presents it as a general truth. Indeed, as he states, if individuals' inner dispositions are bad, this evil will revert to them externally through the self-same process. The vehicle of this metaphor involves agriculture and irrigation. The soul waters external existence, which then yields either good or bad crops. You reap what you sow. So that is not just by your action, but by the disposition of your soul itself. So in this view, the unfolding of exterior existence responds to your interior consciousness. But the trajectory of Kubrā's thinking goes well beyond this, towards even collapsing reality and consciousness. In his formulations, he sometimes wholly resolves the object into the subject. This is a finding made, he claims, in the course of traveling the path. Quote, "Heaven, earth, and the divine footstool are not things external to you, and neither is the garden of paradise and hellfire, nor death, nor life. They are simply things within you, and if you travel spiritually and become pure, you perceive that clearly, God willing." Unquote. To take this view as a version of solipsism, the theory that nothing is knowable beyond the individual's private consciousness, thus negating the very reality of the world at large, would be a misrepresentation. The basic premise of Kubrā's perspective is the distinction of the microcosm from the macrocosm. So his subtler point is rather that the mystic discovers that the contents of his or her consciousness are true manifestations on the scale appropriate to the individual of cosmic and even metacosmic realities. Insofar as those contents of the microcosm are contiguous with and in their deepest roots at one with these external cosmological realities, the mystic can come to know them through his or her own interior by processes of spiritual development. Thus, in this perspective, any ultimate distinction between cognition and self-cognition indeed collapses. All cognition is taken to be, in an ultimate sense, self-cognition. And I believe we see this continuing as a trend in his successors like Najmuddin Daya and Senani. On such premises, it's no great leap to an idea of the accomplished mystic as not just passively subjected to the relationship of internal and external domains, like normal people, but as an active participant generating generating events in the external domain through his or her acts of consciousness. Kubrā articulates this shift from passivity to activity, if you like, in various ways. The key to this Sufi thaumatology, or course in miracles, is determination or zeal, himma, an awakening to the interplay of the two domains and a conscious exertion to take control of their relation. And he describes the Sufi's culminating development of what he calls a hand of determination, yadul himma, through 3 steps that lead from 1, dreaming of doing extraordinary things while one is asleep, as most people sleep, and 2, developing the capacity for lucid dreaming, and so intentionally to dream of doing extraordinary things of the kind. Finally, to 3, carrying this over into a fully waking state, at which time the power is gained actually to perform such deeds in the external world of phenomenal experience, alam al-shahada, with the hand of determination. This progression to thaumaturgical empowerment through the 3 states of sleeping, the state between sleeping and waking, is mentioned various times, including in the following, where Kubrā specifically refers to the miracles which go on to be performed as takween. Quote, "The mystical state has starting and end points. The start of it is sleep, then the phenomenon which is between waking and sleep, then the mystical state, then witnessing divine power and then being oneself attributed with divine power. Then after all of that, the ability to bring things into existence, takween," unquote. The Fawā'ih also discusses this phased cultivation of thaumaturgical determination using an alternative framework. Determination is throughout the mystic's propulsive energy, and his or her entire ability to travel the path is dependent on determination, just as a rider on a journey relies on a horse. As the mystic's determination develops through its initial and intermediate stages to its perfected stages, it passes through a sequence of 3 mystical faculties: the heart, qalb, the spirit, ruh, and the mysterium, sir. I affectionately use here Kurbā's translation. These terms are in themselves, of course, fundamental to the pre-existing Sufi framework inherited by Kubrā, but in Kubrāwi theory itself, the way of considering them as constituting the subtle anatomy of the human microcosm was emphasized and would be explored more literally, such that they came to be fully treated as an ascending chain of occult internal organs or plexuses. This way of thinking is arguably determined by Kubrā himself in his writings, especially the Fawā'ih, since he speaks there of his ability to perceive his own spiritual constitution as auras, coronal discharges, and sounds, describing them in detail. In 1, the heart, the mystic's power of volition converts into a goal-focused seeking, which then converts into a power of independent action, tasarruf. It is through ascent to the next level, to the spirit, that access is given to what Kubrā calls a rabd al-dhawqi, a linkage involving direct taste, an experiential nexus, if you will. This connects the mystic with a given target or sought object, like a thrown javelin or a connective chain. And so the last of the levels is reached, 3, the Mysterium. This crucial subtle center is the intersection of the human identity of the mystic with the divine, where our author speaks of actual contact, al-wasl, or consummation between the human lover and the divine beloved as taking place. As-sirru yajma'u al-ahbab, he says. Kubrā says that at this level, there is a mingling with and mergence into divine power. Thus, the mystic comes to be invested with the very capacity to generate things in existence, takween. The power of takween is explicitly formulated by our author as the mystic's investment with God's creative command, this marking his or her arrival at sainthood, the status of God's friend. Quote, know that the mystical traveler is only attributed with sainthood when kun, be, is given, kun being the command of the real. In his statement, our command to something when we will it is simply that we say to it, be, and it is. This is quoting Quran chapter 16, verse 40. Corresponding with our author's notions here, his contemporary Ibn Arabi also alludes to certain mystics who use their power of determination, himma, for takween, but he criticizes and demotes them for this. Such possessors of the creative command, he says, are possessors of riches, but according to a hadith, the possessors of riches are imprisoned. Whereas the true Muhammadan saint aims to be utterly destitute, Ibn Arabi continues, hence, remaining in one's own route is preferable, and this is what is indicated by his words to the noblest of mankind, the most complete of them in witnessing, and the highest of them in existence, viz. Muhammad, nothing of the command belongs to thee, quoting Quran chapter 3, verse 1 to 8, and this is from William Chittick's translation. Kubrā, for his part, of course, insists that the power of takween is not invested in anyone who retains any sense of their independence from God, and it precisely only ensues for the accomplished Sufis, from the accomplished Sufis' complete spiritual poverty or extinction in God, al-fana. Quote, the saint is only given kun when his will passes away into the will of the real, unquote. But on the other hand, Kubrā also clearly indicates that it is a kind of synergy of wills that results. Quote, the real wills nothing without the slave willing it, and the slave wills nothing without the real willing it. The allusion is to him in his statement, you do not will, except that God, the Lord of the worlds, wills. Quran chapter 81, verse 29. Kubrā also presents the advent of the power of takween in terms of another ternary, in this time in cognizing the divine attributes. The relationship with the latter has three ascending steps taken by the mystic within his or her heart. Firstly, apprehending the divine attributes as objects of knowledge. Next, by an experiential witnessing, but one that turns out to be two-way, such that the heart witnesses the divine attributes and the divine attributes witness the heart. Lastly, by the heart's own configuration, ittisaf or takhalluk, by the divine attributes, so they operate as it were as its own attributes, i.e. as the attributes of the heart of the mystic. And the term takhalluk evokes the Sufi dictum, often presented as a hadith, takhallaqu bi akhlaqillah, configure yourselves with God's traits. Kubrā's account of this process is rooted in a premise of what I call homological cognition, the idea that the subject's cognition of an object is based on the principle of like to like. That is, that there must be something of the cognized in the cognizer for cognition to operate at all. In the case of apprehending divine qualities, the upshot of this theory is theologically explosive and ensues in the idea of the saint's own takween. So a final threefold model for the realization of takween must be mentioned that is also put forward by Kubrā. He presents it as the third stage of the process, designated paronomastically, using the second form masdar as talween, coloration, tamkeen, consolidation, takween, existentiation. The terms may be connected with the model of alchemy, alchemy and its operations, which are explicitly evoked by him as the model for his Sufism. He says, our method is the method of alchemy. A key operation in alchemy is precisely coloration, talween, otherwise known as dyeing, sabgh. In Kubrā's Lexis, coloration denotes the as yet unstable and external association with a spiritual state. Next, consolidation signifies a shift when the state becomes fully stabilized through internalization. And again, this idea may relate to the alchemical operation of fixing, aqd, the dye. Our author evidently adopts these twin terms from his Sohrawardi teachers. For instance, Ammar al-Bidlisi, died circa 596 or 1200 CE, who was arguably Kubrā's main Sohrawardi link. He uses the same terminological progression, talween, tamkeen. The terms also have their role in the Awarif al-Ma'arif of Abu Hafs Omar al-Sohrawardi. And incidentally, Ibn Arabi also uses this terminology, except that in his case he places talween higher than tamkeen, since it, talween, coloration, corresponds to the nature of things, the divine self-transmutation in forms. I'm quoting William Chittick again here. These catchwords are inherited by all these mystical theorists from a Sufi vocabulary already crystallized by the 5th, 11th century. We thus find them in the writings of Qushayri, who dedicated a chapter of his famous Risala to their definition and illustration, quoting even earlier authorities such as Abu Ali ad-Daqqaq, who died in 1015 CE. But for Kubrā, the Sufi analog of the great work only culminates beyond these two phases in takween. The prior two terms thus only make sense within the full ternary. Takween is when the human subject is extinguished in the state's bestower, namely God, who as it were replaces the human subject. I'm quoting Kubrā, the first stage, talween, is external knowledge. Next, tamkeen is an inner state. And then takween is passing away from the inner state in him who gives the inner state, God. It seems that the term takween, as it is used in this particular three-step series by Kubrā, is, like the other two terms, influenced by earlier traditions of Muslim alchemy. This may be one provenance of the ternary. It is crucially a technical term. Takween is a technical term found in the corpus of Jabir ibn Hayyan, reputedly died in 200 or 815, that greatest of all Muslim alchemists. It has been said that takween, in the way that Jabir ibn Hayyan uses it, expresses the metaphysical and material process of the generation of life, animal, vegetable, and mineral. From the emic perspective of the alchemist, the act of takween was an emulation of the divine, creative, life-giving powers of Genesis and resurrection. I'm quoting Kathleen O'Connor, excuse me. An important early treatment of alchemical takween is found in Jabir's Kitab al-Tajmi', the book of assembling. Despite alluding by the term takween to the Quranic idea of the existentiating command kun, the use of the term here evidently also springs from the peripatetic antonyms al-kawn wal-fasad, generation and corruption, in which kawn signifies the generation of entities out of pre-existing matter, rather than existentiation in the theological sense of creation. For Jabir, it specifically refers to animation, or how an accomplished alchemist can even change inanimate objects into living beings. Be that as it may, from the above, it becomes clear that the acquisition of the power to actually existentiate a kind of co-creativity, which is why I describe this as theurgy, is consistently presented by Kubrā as the culmination of the mystical path, formulated in terms of four tripartite processes. 1, from sleep to lucid dreaming to waking. 2, from the subtle center of the heart to that of the spirit to that of the mysterium. 3, from knowing the divine attributes to experiencing the two-way relationship with them, to configuration by them. And 4, from coloration to consolidation to existentiation. Many thanks for listening.